This should work. Oh, they have already started and just were too lazy to announce it to anyone. I don't know why they are just going, but alright. Here we are going. Arden against ChuckPhil for anyone who isn't in the know. Maybe I should leave that explanation until later for when someone who actually isn't in the know is actually in the stream chat. And let's check out this game instead. H4 is a curious variation, has been popping up here and then. I believe Grishuk played a few games even in the candidates with this. Or am I misremembering? In some tournament Grishuk played this like 3 times and said it's crap, but he has to keep playing it until he wins a game with it or something. Was quite a curious explanation as to why he keeps doing it, but then he ended up winning a game with it, so perhaps he has dropped it now. Chuck has lost the game badly in this recently, so he is perhaps not quite happy to see it, but it also meant that he has invested a lot of time now into perhaps plugging this hole in his repertoire. So they are rushing down the moves, and Chuck is just dropping below his starting time in 10+5 on move 11, because apparently up to here all of this was his preparation. Arden did spend a bit of time, and okay, this is most certainly a position. The H file is open. White has the center. The black king is under attack. These knights are well positioned to go wherever they like. On the flip side, black does have an extra pawn. This bishop is sort of locked in by the queen side, so it doesn't really have anywhere great to go. And if black somehow manages to unravel, he will have an advantage, as these pawns are very far advanced. So while right now they are quite menacing, and okay, this one was just hanging. Let me finish my sentence. As right now these pawns are quite menacing, but if black manages to develop some pieces, they will just turn into weaknesses, as they will be difficult to support. I did not notice that it was just hanging straight away, so which already happened, I guess. D6 now also, so Chuck is up 2 pawns and is more or less threatening to win a third. I assume this is still Arden's prep. Arden is Sonata2, in case someone does not know. Sonata wrote in the chat that his main concern is forgetting his prep and getting a horrible position, which is quite understandable. This is entirely irrational. Arden has sacrificed 2 pawns already. This one might also be gone. Although then I assume the point is queen d5 check, and he is picking up a rook. So it's not quite that simple to just take the pawn. Perhaps you can take it with the queen instead. And Chuck does so. He first takes on c3, then decides to take on d6 with the queen, now up 3 pawns with a better structure, and while the king is quite open and the protective dark squared bishop on g7 is gone. 3 pawns are 3 pawns. If Arden does not find a very concrete reason as to why he can get away with sacrificing 3 pawns while claiming that he may have forgotten his prep, this would be quite the suboptimal position. f2 is now also hanging, and Arden essentially has to play for this queen side still being somewhat locked in and undeveloped, but frankly I am not seeing any real compensation for the pawns. If he had 2 powerful bishops, I would believe it, but as I mentioned, this bishop is actually not really doing a whole lot. Gets restricted by the pawn on c4, which can't be touched. So he can only play bishop e2, might then go to f3, but for example, if right now rook takes f2 came, bishop e2 would already be unavailable. So perhaps Chuck can even get away with tripling down, quadrupling down on the grid and getting a 4th pawn, less to win the pawn, more to activate his rook. But okay, he says, I have enough material already. I'm just interested in developing my pieces now, which by all means is fair enough. Bishop e2, you could for example play bishop b7, which is also taking bishop f3 out of the equation. And well, bishop g4 then places the second bishop nicely. This all took quite a while and allows black to pretty much finish his development with something like knight f6, after which white frankly just looks lost. So I'm very curious whether there is a great trick coming soon. But for now, I would assume Arden forgot his prep somewhere, played some moves too quickly, mixed them up, something, and is now more or less busted. As I don't know this line, I shall take the liberty of checking it out in the analysis board with the database open to see what's going on here. All of this is theory. e5 still, knight g4, and here the book has 26 games, and in all of them d6 is played directly to well, directly play for this queen d5 idea without allowing queen takes d6 anywhere, as the pawn is still defending d6, which presumably makes it more difficult for black to unravel the position in the center. Having to deal with this threat, and something like bishop b7, I assume there's then bishop g5, right? Pinning this pawn, not allowing black to take on d6 with anything. And there's one game with knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes d6, knight g4, which looks vaguely similar to the game, but I assume leaves white a bit better placed, while sacrificing not quite as much material. So I assume this was a preparation mix-up where he should have gone d6 with a later bishop g5, and instead when bishop g5 directly d6 later, which doesn't even have any games in the lead chess database. So safe assumption to be made that this was not a great novelty, but instead just a mix up of the preparation. And Arden is now severely on the back foot. Has to find some tricks to survive. After knight d7, he went for f4 to deny some squares, to potentially push for f5, and of course to defend the hanging pawn on f2. Makes sense. On the other hand, puts a pawn on a dark square, while black is left with just a light squared bishop. So now this bishop on g5 isn't too happy of a camper anymore, sort of locked in here. There are vague threats of it getting trapped at some point in the future when black does something of this sort. Well, okay, that is very far in the future. For now, obviously, the bishop should be quite stable here. And if you do push f5 at some point, it doesn't matter a great deal anyway. Still, you would, in theory, have preferred to go for something like f3 to avoid the inevitable bishop b7 target barreling down like the long diagonal. After f3 it's sort of controlled. Problem then is just this bishop is never getting into the game, as this square is covered by the black pawn, and going to e2 would not help, as the bishop is locked in by its own pawn on f3. So I understand Arden saying, okay, I need to at least get my pieces out some way. And for that I need this pawn to be on a dark square. They continue developing, knight f6. Arden finally takes the pawn on d6, which Chuck had refused to defend for the past few moves. But knight e4 now forks these two pieces and might remove basically the sole trump that Arden has left in the position, as the bishop pair is gonna drop whenever Chuck so desires. However, after takes, this pawn would be decent, and this pawn would still be hanging. So Chuck decides against it, says, haha, I just made this look like a fork. I'm not actually interested in this dark squared bishop. What I wanted was to get my knight to an excellent square where it will be difficult to budge, as, repeating myself, this square is covered for the white bishop, so you would be forced to go bishop e2 f3 to attack this knight at all. In the meantime, it is targeting c3, controlling large parts of the board, while at the same time fulfilling some defensive duties in holding the c5 pawn alive. So white remains in quite a bit of trouble, has managed to win one of the 3 pawns back. If he could also win this one and perhaps trade a set of minor pieces or so, he would have decent drawing chances, so he can't be written off yet. But this certainly is a threatening position to be in. Knight takes, rook takes, knight takes, type deals are on the cards. This is coming with check. And white is still behind. White is now suddenly the one. Sorry. White is now suddenly the one behind in development. As this bishop is still boxed in. This rook isn't doing anything anymore on the h file after we have traded the queens. There are not going to be any mating threats anytime soon. So he should try to hurry up with his development in such a fashion. But I said, for example, after bishop e2, you would just take here with tempo, bishop has to move, you take here with check, and presumably white has to resign. So again, Arden, who is behind in material and down on the clock, who really needs to seek out activity, get his counterplay going, is instead forced to play yet another defensive move. It's not developing, just trying to hold these queenside weaknesses together, which is unpleasant. Knight g3 can come at any point, picking up that part of the bishop pair if he so desires. Not that I expect that to happen, as it would leave him with opposite color bishops, and this bishop is quite bad to begin with, while this knight is godlike. But for example, if bishop e2 could be sort of a threat to go knight g3, taking the rook, which is forced to go to e1 to defend the bishop, which is also hanging, and then you just take it anyway, as he has just played rook e8 and is controlling the e2 square. So these pieces can't actually move, which means black's position would be fantastic and dominant if they had equal material. Instead, Chuck is not just one, but 2 pawns up and has more than enough compensation on top, which does not bode well for Arden. Rook h4 played, which is a rather curious choice. I'm not sure what this accomplishes. Knight g3 looks like it threatens to just pick up material. I assume you would be forced to go rook d1 unless you give up the whole piece. I'm not sure what this rook is doing here, as both of these squares are covered and this pawn didn't need any defending. I assume the point might be to go g4 to budge the dark squared bishop, light squared bishop, sorry. But yeah, knight g3, the most natural move in the position, attacking the hanging bishop, just blocks the g-pawn. So rook h4 is left without too much of an effect. And this bishop is so hanging that rook d1 is required. Again, putting a piece passive, and as I feared, Arden just says, okay, whatever, I'm falling apart anyway, I take here, now I have time to go g4 perhaps. Okay, he seeks counterplay along the 7th, but yeah, h5 is played. Again, cutting the rook on h4 out of the action. There is now a threat of rook g7 check, but it doesn't actually do anything. Just play king f8. There isn't much of a follow-up, and Chuck is unafraid, just gives a check. Says, I'm gonna bring my pieces back. I'm gonna take your pawns. This bishop is quite strong, making us perfectly safe here. You aren't really threatening anything. And okay, a5 is also quite nice, boxing in the king, threatening to go b4 in the future, defending this pawn from the attack, so this rook has an easier time getting in. Rook h8 is a threat, so to speak, but Chuck is gonna spot that his rook is hanging. Chuck doesn't even care that his rook is hanging and just says, I'm gonna take on a2 next move, and you are mated, which is true. And Arden resigns and quickly hits the rematch button. 1-0 to Chuck. Very nice play by Chuck, with the neat final touch to sacrifice his rook as he's just mating. What is happening now? Arden, who is normally a Taimanov player, has in the second game decided to go for the Sicilian Khan instead. It is related to the Taimanov, so it's not too surprising that Arden is also capable of playing Queen c7 instead of a6 instead of knight c6. And perhaps is doing this to get a familiar looking position while avoiding Chuck's prep for the Taimanov, which makes quite a bit of sense. You don't want to be stuck in this bishop e3, queen f3, for example, variation, deeply prepped, much less in rapid, where you don't have time to figure out what's going on. Welcome to the stream, Foracle. Not sure if I greeted you yet. And okay, Arden's position looks perfectly fine this time around. I have no qualms whatsoever with it. We now have an e4, e5 structure with the traded d-pawns, which I'm not quite sure what opening that would come from. I suppose the more natural way of getting here would be some e4, e5 opening, like Philidor type, where black went e4, d6, white went d4, took, and type of stuff would normally happen to arrive at this type of position, like basically a mirrored French exchange, where you would be having the pawns on the d file instead. But yeah, these pawns on the queen side are quite solid. Not much going on. You go knight f6, bishop c5, castle short, and black most certainly has solved his opening problems in this game. Knight d1 was quite curious on the last turn by Chuck. I assume the idea is to do some c3 knight up here, but that stands in the way of his own bishop. I'm not quite clear where these pieces want to go. Bishop g5 is of course vaguely natural, but at the same time the queen already stepped out of the pin, so it's not the greatest deal, and like it's not like the knight is controlling an important square here. It's like covered by pawns, so can't do much with the d5 square anyway. So bishop g5 isn't too effective. I assume the idea now is to develop the bishop to b2, and then it's not entirely clear to me why knight d1, knight e3 this early was necessary, where you couldn't just leave the knight here and bother with developing the bishop first. But okay, maybe he isn't quite sure yet where he wants his bishop to have, whether on b2 or in the future on e3, g5, and says my knight on c3 is abysmal. It has to reroute. Like, there's nothing going on the queen side ever. This pawn on e4 doesn't need any defenses, since the bishop on f3 does a good job at that. So with the knight having to move at some point in the future anyway, you might as well do so first. keep the bishop flexible. And normally you would do some knight e2, knight g3 or the likes, but with a queen in the way, basically knight d1 is the only sensible move. And it does have a decent square on f5, which Ardin doesn't want to allow. Goes g6, bishop g7 to shove this knight out from e3. Quite a curious position. Both players, like, assume Chuck is gonna play g3 perhaps at some point. Both players with a kingside fianchetto in an e4, e5 structure, which you do not see every day. The open d file might end up playing an important role in the future. Might also just mean that some rooks get traded and nothing else is going on. Chuck with yet another curious decision. Bishop d2. I assume he feels like the bishop has more future on one of these squares. And like after b3, bishop b2. Not bad, just interesting. Perhaps he wants to go to c3 without blocking his c-pawn, so he just says, I can push c4 now. Foracle says he's just abusing the weak dark squares on the queen side, which does make sense. All pawns are on light squares here, and the bishop just went to g7, so it will be difficult to control these. And perhaps Chuck feels like he will be able to, for example, park his bishop here, be untouchable, while b2, a3 might be more natural squares, but are less offensive effective overall. Some more normal developing moves, putting the rooks on the d file. Chuck is, by the way, playing quite fast, having a 1.5 minute time edge on Ardin. And Otto is asking whether b4 is working out for black. What does b4 do? Bishop takes, queen b6, bishop c3 back, and I just lost a pawn. b4, bishop takes c5, Otto thought. I mean, that does avoid getting blockaded on the dark squares, but instead you just lose a pawn. That's the idea, to activate these two wider pieces onto the e4 square. Feels odd. Ardin goes a different route, or perhaps the same route, planning to go b4, just preparing it first. Has recognized that these squares on the queen side are quite weak. Gets his bishop back out from g7 to cover some of the dark holes on his queen side. And quite an instructive game, I guess, we are seeing played here. Queen e1, again doubling down on this diagonal, saying I am gonna get, for example, bishop e4 in at some point to blockade on the dark squares. The ideal goal for white in this position is to go like bishop b4, takes, takes, then push c5, lock these pawns onto the light squares, lock this bishop on b7 into stupidity, and win at some point from there by just having effectively an extra piece. Yusupov would be proud of queen e1, just dominating this diagonal. I just wanted to switch browser windows and ended up starting Steam by accident. So apologies if there is some lag. Cancel, thanks. It started updating Steam and whatnot, but okay, should be working again now. After queen e1, Arden says he's gonna go b4 anyway. So takes, c5. The queen has to leave, and you take on e4, having created some counterplay along this diagonal. And asking white whether the sole bishop on f3 is actually enough to hold this pawn, which it might not be. On the flip side, it does leave you with some big holes on the king side. It does allow some knight d5 in the future. So even if you get the pawn back there, I'm not quite sure how happy you actually are. But I assume everything is better than allowing this dark square lockdown. Oh boy. This is a tough position to play for ball. Takes. You could also go c5 directly, but I assume that's not the intent. Chuck wants to have nothing to do with Arden getting counterplay and plays rook c1. The point here is he's threatening to push c5 again, locking in the light squared bishop, and black can go c5 to avoid that. Well then, as said, he is giving up the d5 square, which the knight can jump into no problem. Also then instead his dark squared bishop is kind of boxed in, like being able to go here and here, but with all pawns on the dark squares it would not have a great future. So it's not quite clear what Arden should be doing about this. Foracle advises a5, c5, and bishop a6, which would get the bishop out along this diagonal, while creating a relatively solid structure on the queen side. Arden prevents the pawn move to c5 by just putting his bishop there, which is the best of both worlds. His bishop is now quite nicely placed, and he hasn't given up the critical d5 square, which he would have if he had played c6. Still, the bishop on b7 is a worry, and these holes on the dark squares are another worry. And Chuck is sort of saying, okay, don't want to allow some mess in the center here. You just pulled away a key defender from your king. Gonna trade off another one. If these knights are traded, the pressure on e4 is also significantly lessened, so any sort of future counterplay with c5 around the bishop on b7 will be comparably ineffective. And now there are threats of just going like bishop h6 and getting the queen here and checkmating. These dark squares are quite abundant. Very high level play by both, being super positionally aware, always centering around these dark squares on the queen side for the first, whatever, 15 moves. And then as Ardin has gotten some sort of setup where he says, okay, my queen side is stable, Chuck says, fair enough, but you have now pulled away all your key pieces from the king side. So I shall be switching some amount of action over there and go bishop g5, take the rook, abuse these dark squares which are now weakened on the king side. Yes, the bishop had to leave to support the weak dark squares on the queen side. Ambitious. Ardin is not concerned, and well, the bishop on d4 is obviously a monster, controlling the entire board, clogging up the d-file. c5 can come next when it is entirely untouchable. This pawn becomes somewhat of a target, and perhaps some f5, whatever, can create kingside troubles. At the same time, however, this bishop is now never going to help out on the king side again. These are forever dead. As previously, he still had the option to drop the bishop back, or like bishop f8, bishop g7, and say, okay, queen side is stabilized now. I shall get my bishop back and stabilize the king side again. Instead, he goes essentially on the offensive and says he doesn't need any defenses, wants his own trumps in the position, does not like the comparably passive idea of bishop f8, g7 back. And well, if this works out, it's very strong. If this doesn't work out, he's getting mated on the king side. There's some h4, h5 coming. There's some bishop f6, queen h6 coming. There might be some bishop e7 in the future. There might even have been a queen f6, just trading, saying you aren't getting rid of this. There might be some rook e6, rook e3, rook h3, which is, it's wild. And it does not stop being wild. Ardin is concerned about this weak square on f6, goes king g7 to cover it, and Chuck, tactically aware, pushes c5. Can't be taken by the bishop, obviously, since it's pinned, and I assume the idea is if the queen takes, she leaves the defenses of the king which might mean you are losing. Chuck is hanging 2 pawns in the current position and doesn't care about either, as he says, okay, these dark squares are too weak, this bishop is not defending them anytime soon, you are getting mated. Queen f8 is another high risk choice, but I assume at this point you are sort of bound by high risk choices. Bishop f6 locks the king to g8. Now h6 is covered, so there won't be a mate soon, but like h4, h5 can still come. White can go b3 here, just safeguard his position for now and say you aren't getting rid of this bishop and you can't really improve your pieces anymore. So that is its own problem. Vorigel says queen f8 is forced. Fair enough. I'm not good enough at these quick calculations to figure out what's forced or not. I essentially missed mate in 2 in my last 45-45 30+30 lone wolf game. So I'm the wrong guy to ask what's forced defensively and what isn't. But this looks rather quite scary for sure. Queen takes c5 now. Arden says he was quite concerned about queen f6 in the previous position, so he went for these defensive moves and says now he isn't concerned about anything anymore because he will always be able to go queen f8 back. Vorigel does point out it does hit f2 with check, but I don't think can you actually take that? I don't think you can actually take that. Like if I go queen h6, you take, I just step out while attacking the bishop. You can give another check here on a6, but I always have like bishop e2 to block. And then I assume I'm winning somewhere. You might have takes, king takes, queen check from here, but I go rook d2. And like if at some point you have to go back to f8, then I would be able to just straight and take the now undefended bishop on f2. So after queen h6, I believe queen f8 would be forced. Well, okay, after queen h6, queen f8, you have to move your queen again, so it's not a great accomplishment either. Arden goes for queen h4, covering the f2 pawn, potentially threatening bishop e7, which Arden doesn't want to allow, goes just queen f8 back. And the last attacker is joining the fray. This looks rather quite dangerous. h5 played directly and is taken directly, which I don't like. I'm not sure why he took this pawn. Like it might be completely winning, wouldn't surprise me a great deal. But in this position, I thought you'd just go rook h3. Like the bishop is never hanging. And after you have put the rook there, you can still take here if you want at some later point. tactics which don't work out. Okay, let's go back quickly as Chuck is up 2-0 to see the finish of this game. The computer, by the way, says -3 here, so I guess the whole attack was a lie. I just wanted to keep taking pawns on b2. Quite curious. So Adin went h5 here, which, yeah, I also didn't like. Still, bishop h5 felt a bit too quick. But okay, if you can't really take that pawn back, I guess it doesn't matter too much which move order you choose. You went queen h6 in hopes of being able to get the queens off somewhere. Queen g4, queen takes. If queen takes, pawn takes, black would be quite happy as there's no mate coming anymore. Some check, king h6. But white just went rook h3. Ignored the threat to his queen. You can't take the queen because you are mated. And Adin was banking on this move bishop c8 with some counter threats. But yeah, it doesn't help. Just went rook Chuck just went rook h5 anyway. There's still this mate to be worried about. You can't even take back here because the pawn is pinned, so resignation was imminent. I believe actually you could also have taken like this, so bishop c8 didn't help in any case, because here you're still getting mated next move and have no reply to that. But yeah, rook h5 was nicer. So this is now a match point for Chuck, and it looks like his position is completely winning. How is this bishop landing on c3? Where is this knight? Assume you can unravel with bishop b2. But you are not happy here as white. Let's go through this move by move to see what happened. Adin goes for the reversed modern. Chuck is taking the bull by the horns, going for the big pawn center. Not concerned about anything. Okay, I believe now it's starting to become like a reversed hippo. But weakening all these dark squares may have been a bit too happy. Knight d2, bishop c3, rook b1 forced. This bishop is kind of good. You might be able to go bishop b2 at some point and trade it off, but then these are all long-term weaknesses on the dark squares, so it's not something you really enjoy doing. Meanwhile, black has played nothing but the most natural move in the position on every turn. So white sort of slid into something deeply uncomfortable. And knight h3, knight c6. Just keeping on with the normal moves. Castle, bishop g4. There are some threats of, for example, knight d4 coming, and this pawn is not a happy camper. e4 is coming. This bishop is dominant. This bishop is dominant. These knights are on the natural squares. The central pawns are powerful. And white has an array of clumsy pieces. So, as Oracle says, Chuck is playing super strong chess. Feels like he's dominant, basically start to finish in every single game. Although in the last one The computer, at least at low depth, yelled that the whole attack was essentially a lie, but who cares? Practical play is what matters. And Arden did not find the right defensive moves there in time pressure. Fate is pointing out that he does not think 10+5 is a good time control to play bullet systems, which is fair enough, I suppose. F4 creating counterplay against the black center is just met with bishop g4, asking white how happy he is about having just crucially weakened his light squares. Queen e1, and this remains an odd piece clump, while all of black's pieces are on their most natural squares, and the center is dissolving at the earliest convenience. Knight d4 landed on the board. c2 is hanging. The knight is dominating the board. Bishop b2 might have been forced with the idea to defend the pawn on c2 from b2, which is not normal, but okay. Modern problems require modern solutions. Black just ignores it and takes on c2 anyway, because it's attacking a queen. And he's in time to take on b2 here, if he needs to. If queen takes, he just retreats the bishop. If something takes here, he retreats the knight. On the other hand, at least now the c file is open. Perhaps that's useful. So the idea would be something like rook b2, knight goes back. Okay, never mind. Guess that's not happening. Still, I could see some sort of idea happening here in the center. Attacks the rook, and Arden just doesn't care. Says, my position is not great, take my rook, I don't care anymore. Little Smurf is asking whether that works, and I would say no, it doesn't, but the position is busted anyway, so you might as well try it. But yeah, there isn't actually a second piece targeting f7, so there isn't a great deal of threat. Guess you can take here and pretend you're getting pawns, but e5 is hanging and can't really be defended. Maybe you have to play d4, but then the queen on b2 is locked out of the action entirely. Still, presumably the only move that makes any sense. You can't give up the center on top of everything else. So I assume you go d4 and hope for some sort of takes here or takes here, and then bringing the knight somewhere active. You still have a knight on h3. I forgot that this guy exists. So maybe knight here, then this knight here, and try to get some sort of play like this with perhaps queen f2 also thrown into the mix, which, well, at least offers white an idea of play. d4 does end up being played. Still down in exchange for very little. I assume black can just push for a quick c5 to dissolve the bits of the white center that still exist at the moment. And when these three pawns are sort of falling apart, white is left with this unhappy clump of pieces. The queen on b2 is still quite silly. Well, just up material. He goes a different route, just says, okay, you have two good pawns here, but I'm gonna maintain my own center. If you take, I'm gonna take back with my knight, install this dominating piece on d5, which again controls large parts of the board. Can go c6 at any point to support it and just blockade these pawns. Still, white does need the e4 square at some point to be able to act at all. So I assume something like e takes d5 gets played sometime soon. He starts with knight f4, which also makes sense as the knight did nothing. I wasn't quite sure about it because ideally I felt like I want to go knight g5. As in like takes, knight here, and then the other knight to g5 or the likes. But okay, at least he's putting some pressure onto the black center, which is also worth something. Still, I feel like you should have taken here first. The issue is now if you take, black just takes back with a pawn, keeps denying the e4 and c4 pawns, squares, sorry. Which means this knight isn't really getting into the game, which means this queen isn't really getting into the game. I thought it was quite natural to take here, to be able to play knight e4, to be able to play queen f2, and battle down the f-file. While here now you would have to come up with a different course of action. For example, says h3. Okay, yeah, the knight is covering h5, so the bishop would have to go back to some less comfortable square. Perhaps even g4 at that point, keep pushing stuff back. And then you go to h5 and pray that this knight is useful there with some, I don't know, knight f6 ideas. As said, he just takes back with a pawn. It says no knight e4 for you, no bishop e4 for you. I don't like those moves. But while this denies the white knight an inroad into the position and the bishop some sort of e4, at the same time it also means the knight on b6 is quite awful now. Has nowhere to go, sort of stuck defending this pawn for the rest of the game. The pawn is also a weakness now, so it's a bit of a concern. And Arden says this is indeed a weakness. I go a4, threatening a5 to be able to target this knight. And we'll now play some standard moves on the queen side, with these two pieces suddenly being quite useful. Attacking the pawn on d5. This guy on b6 is not defended anymore. You can't really move the rook from the a5 for the moment, as queen takes a4 is threatened. This looks a lot better than it looked like 5 moves ago. Feels like either Chuck has been swimming a bit, or Arden has just been finding very good moves. Bishop e6 is also not really what you want to play. Now this bishop is essentially relegated to big pawn duty. This is a possible route to create issues on the queen side when b7 and d7 are hanging. The two proud rooks, which, well, you got to where was I going with that sentence? He got two proud rooks against one, was happy about his material advantage after taking on f1, but now is the first time that the first rook is actually doing something. Up till here, both of these rooks were essentially dead. and it might be a bit late. White has played excellently, I believe, now creating some sort of threats along the lines of knight f6 check, queen g5, checkmate somewhere. This rook is finally on an open file, but still doesn't really have anywhere to go. This square is covered, this square is covered, this square is covered, this square is covered. You can go on to the second. I suppose it still takes quite a while to actually do anything. This knight on b6 is completely dominated, has nowhere to go. Like d7 is the only real square, and from it can't go anywhere. This one might join the attack, or perhaps via such a route, creating some more issues for the black pieces. Well, this rook is dead, and this knight is dead, and rook f6 is played. And rook f6 is ignored. Welcome to the party, Nightic. This is our esteemed tournament organizer. Queen g5, queen f8. Chuck is 4 minutes up on the clock, which does matter. But most definitely the extra exchange does not matter whatsoever in this position. I'm not 100% sure what went wrong, but most certainly something did. White has been playing extremely strong chess for the last few moves, getting loads of counterplay out of seemingly nowhere, while the black pieces are now a quite ugly clump, and the king on g8 is not happy at all. So obviously the move of choice here is to go knight e4, and if takes, take back and go rook h6, then mate on h7. He has perhaps the same idea. I'm going bishop f1 with, I assume the idea is bishop d3 next. But sadly this gives Chuck a move of time. Going king h8. Stepping out of the pin and saying, I'm gonna take on f6 next move. You never have a mate on g7, as my queen covers the dark squares quite nicely, which, well, might just be true. So the rook has to retreat, can still go to h4 followed by bishop d3, but this is rather looking quite scary. Queen h4, is g5 legal? Trapping the queen? This went wrong. White resigns. Show of force by Chuck, who has played 3 hugely impressive games and takes the first semi-final 3-0 to storm into the grand finals unfazed. Still, this I felt was an excellent game by Arden, who basically for the first time in the match actually managed to get something going. Apparently he was better somewhere in the second game, but it never felt like it. And he certainly did defend that one correctly. But here in this third game, I felt like after the initial hiccup of, as fate called it, playing a bullet opening, which did not work out, he found a load of strong moves to create many threats on the king side, get active pieces, but in the end, For one, it might not have been real either, and Chuck might just have defended well. For two, there was always the underlying issue that due to the early struggles in the opening, Arden was down 5 or 6 minutes on the clock, which is a big deal, of course. And if there was a way to win or pose more problems, Arden was unable to find it, stuck in deep time trouble from like move 20 on. Still, good game to both. And congratulations to Chuck for excellent, strong play. What else can I say? Chuck was the first player in the Grand Prix standings and has proven that this was well deserved. Dominating.